We're delighted that Professor Sir Tom Blundell is able to join us and speak to us tonight. I'm sure everybody knows you, but allow me to give a little bit of puff just before you step up. Professor Sir Tom is a Professor Emeritus of Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge. He's Chair of BBSRC, he's President of the Science Council, he's a Fellow of the Royal Society, a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and just recently has been made an Honorary Fellow of the Society of Biology. He's worked at Oxford, Sussex and London, but has been in Cambridge since the mid-90s, and there he was head of the Department of Biochemistry and head of the School of Biological Sciences. He's done it all. He's worked with industry, he's started his own company, and what many people here will know him for as being a very strong voice for science policy in the UK. He's therefore got a career that spans the whole range of options open to biological scientists. So we are very honoured that you've come to talk to us tonight, and I'd like you to welcome him. Professor Sir Tom Blundell.
Well, Hilary, thank you very much for those kind words. To Andrew, Julian and others, thank you for hosting this. And to the Society of Biology, Mark, thank you very much for arranging for me to be an honorary fellow. That's wonderful. And I ought to thank HUBS, of course, for all the work that you are doing to bring the bioscience community together and also to share best practice across the UK. I've had lots of interactions with HUBS over the years. They've all been very positive, very helpful, and I hope that you've all found the same. Now, my credentials have already been listed to some extent. I was head of department in Birkbeck in 1976, and owing to an ageist policy in Cambridge, I was retired from administration, but I'm still doing research. In 2009. So just to be interactive, I want to know whether anyone else has been head of department for 33 years. No one else here is as unwise as that, maybe. But it's been an extremely interesting experience. And I thought, because the main role of HUBS, as I see it, is to share experiences, I thought I'd do it slightly differently and make a few comments sort of sequentially of the various departments that I've been in. Because if we'd have had a HUBS at the beginning, I could have shared with others, but it took me all those years really to learn in different environments. So Oxford, I got lost around the back of the museum and eventually found the old zoology department in which I was housed for a year or two before I was moved to the Leslie Martin building which housed the new zoology department. I was rather proud of the Leslie Martin building because, as you may know, I was also chairman of the planning committee of Oxford City. I'm a failed politician, by the way. But my comments on Oxford were it was a hugely impressive organisation, very diverse, but I think I went through the years largely unnoticed, so I may be a little biased. But then I moved in '73 to Sussex, and there I found a very different organisation. I found a very multidisciplinary environment. I found John Maynard Smith in the tea room. That was just fantastic. So I went in and started an argument with him, and then realised I hadn't read all his books, so I went the next day to the bookshop. I bought everything that he'd written. I found he'd followed Moto Kimura about neutral evolution, which I thought was all wrong. So the next day I went into the tea room and I engaged him on the errors of Moto Kimura on a number of things that I've been working on. So John said, well, why don't you give a talk to the school? So I did, fantastic. And then he said, oh, well, why didn't you write it up for Nature? And I did, and it was published. And that's the sort of interactiveness in a department that's really fantastic. It was a new department, multidisciplinary, very, I think, welcoming. The problem is that most of us there got promoted rather quickly. Actually, Sussex, of course, didn't have a succession policy, which is another problem, but that's another subject. But then I moved to Birkbeck, and so the third kind of department, I was really on the periphery of biology. I found a young group that were the survivors after the death of Rosalind Franklin, who'd moved there with J.D. Bernal, who recently died. Huge people in my life. I read J.D. Bernal as a student. Erin Klug had just been stolen by Cambridge, and Ken Holmes by Embo. And all we had was a small group of people who were slightly older than me, and I was the only one with a grant. So I wondered what we should do on this. And so I decided we probably ought to all work together. And that wasn't a bad idea. We formed multi-principal investigator, if you like, teams, and everything worked. It was just amazing. But before I say, what came out of it in terms of science, the first thing that came out of it was gender diversity. We had lots of women, an equal number of women in it. Working together was just amazingly helpful in getting everybody involved. We got a multinational team very, very quickly. People came and joined in. And of course it was multidisciplinary because we could do things together. Now, many people think that working together in groups like that, in fact, leads you downwards because you never get a first author or a last author paper. But I want to say that we got lots of nature papers. We got grants, and we even got a large number of people elected to the Royal Society. So out of a little group that had no money, we ended up with 6 fellows of the Royal Society. And what I'm most proud of is that 3 of them are women. And they were all physicists. And so there was Janet Thornton, of course, done rather well. Julia Goodfellow, done rather well. And Helen Sable, who's just given us a great talk today, one of the leading electron microscopists, also a fellow of the Royal Society. So working together, I suddenly discovered, was really not only enjoyable, but it was hugely productive. So that was a totally different environment from the Sussex one, but something I learned from it. And then I moved to Cambridge. God, that was a shock. I mean, first there was Jean Thomas, who was just amazing in biochemistry, and one or 2 other women, but everybody worked individually. It was male-dominated. A large number of people had been appointed from Cambridge, didn't know anything about the world. They stayed there all the time. And they were, of course, all very clever and very confident, and were doing rather well. Now, I think we're still doing well at Cambridge, but I think we're a little bit more collaborative. We've got a few more women, and some of the things that I learned from the other departments, I was able to encourage in Cambridge. So, really helping each other by very different experiences. And the fact that biology is so diverse, and the structures are historically defined quite often, but you can learn very much from each other. I think that's the main message that HUBS tells us about, and you're doing that extremely well. So the other thing I think we have to remember is in 2012, bioscience is really becoming just incredibly important, not only to science reputation in the UK, but to Britain, our economy, and our social welfare. Bioscience, of course, has been built on a very strong interdisciplinary background in the 30s to 60s. We had Haldane, 2 Hodgkins, Huxley, Bernal, Proutz, Crick, and Meadower, of course, many others. We had a very, very strong and supportive start. And then we had some rather good research councils, the MRC, NERC, the old ARC, and the SERC. And of course, ARC, NERC morphed into AFRC, and then AFRC and CERC morphed into BBSRC and EPSRC. And they've all been excellent over the years. But I think one thing we should remember is that there's been very little flow of support from the physical sciences, which have always been expensive, over to the biological sciences that used to be less expensive. And we should remember we're totally dependent over the years in having funding from charities. I think if we'd not had the Wellcome Trust, if we'd not had Cancer Research UK, if we'd not had British Heart Foundation, breast cancer breakthrough and everything else, I think British biological sciences would not have been so strong. So what can HUBS do to help, I guess, is the question. And my initial response, of course, is that you just got to keep up this excellence in teaching and basic scientific research in our departments, because anything else we do will fail unless we get that right. So that's absolutely essential. But what we've got to do is to collaborate, and that's what HUBS is about, if I understand it. Of course, we still have this feeling about competition in science, and I often think about this. And you know, one of my favourite stories is this one about Jack and Brian who went camping. I'm sure you've heard this from me before if you've been anywhere around. But you know, Jack and Brian looked out of their tent in the morning, and there was a huge bear outside. And Jack very quickly started to put on his running shoes. And Brian said, "Hey, Jack, there's no point putting on your running shoes. The bear can run much faster than you." And Jack said, "I don't need to run faster than the bear. I just need to run faster than you." And of course, that is a very destructive aspect of the competition. We need to collaborate. Now, I'm not quite sure what the conclusions are from that little story about what you would do if you woke up as a HUBS in a tent together and saw a bear. But it has a general message, of course. But what can we do if we're going to collaborate? Well, first, you've got to be active, proactive ambassadors for the biosciences. You've got to take the case to government. It's difficult for politicians if they don't have a constituency that's constantly putting the case forward. So all of you have got to get out there and talk the talk as far as you can. The biosciences are absolutely central to sustainable growth, and one of the good things that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years, if you look at the Technology Strategy Board, TSB, it was a sort of child of the DTI, and it was created mainly to do cars and manufacturing and things, didn't do much else. But if you look what's happened over the last few years, you'll see there's a huge increase of funding in medical and in what life sciences. The government keeps calling things life sciences and only think about medicine. They're much broader than that, of course. But there's a huge growth in the medical biosciences in the Technology Strategy Board, and that's very good. And there's some signs that they're recognizing that things like food security, bioenergy, and some of the other aspects which are non-medical need support, and actually can create things which are healthy and wealthy, I guess. And the other thing we have to remember is that we've got to act on a global, a national, a regional, and a sectorial level. And so I think it's very helpful if you can bring those kinds of expertise and knowledge to government policy, to the departments, especially not only BIS and the other mainly science departments, but the Treasury, on which everybody blames everything. So we need to keep going. Then I think HUBS can also be a kind of two-way conduit. It and this is, I guess, a sort of chair, a BBSRC sort of statement, we need to keep a communication channel which goes in both ways, from the community to the research councils and through to BIS and through the other way as well. And certainly as chair of BBSRC, I very much value and would like to see more interaction between our research council and the community, because otherwise I think we don't do the right thing, and if we do, you may not understand what we're doing. And the other challenge that I just might mention is this open access, where I gather David Willips, like my funders in the Wellcome Trust and everyone else, are very keen. I personally think this is a slightly more complex issue, because what we don't want to do is to have free access but expensive research publishing. In other words, we don't want to transfer the costs entirely from the reader to the producer, because otherwise we'll just have science coming out of the rich nations. But on the other hand, we've got to face up to this and try and find a way where we can both decrease costs to those who will find it more difficult to pay for their research, and I think of large parts of the country, India, South America and so on. But we've got to get a balance in this, but clearly we've got to address this. I think it's something all of HUBS members have to really think about a bit more, because it's really becoming politically more active now, and not just something that if you're funded by the Wellcome Trust, they go through all your publications and they ask, why haven't you mentioned the Wellcome Trust in this one? And you say, well, it's just a review, and so on. I've just been through this. Anyway, I just want to give a few thoughts to close on this whole question of translation. So I'm a person who actually drifted into science because I failed to do all sorts of other things like painting and music and politics and that. But having got in there, I realized it could be useful. And what gave me most pleasure, I think, was finding somebody like my mentor in Oxford, Dorothy Hodgkin, who, you know, was married to a communist. She never really declared her party orientation. She was banned from North America by the McCarthy period. But when I joined the team, we drifted into all these companies. Of course, my colleagues on high table in Oxford used to say, you know, what's Dorothy doing? Is she going to teach them things? And I tried to explain that actually in industry they did all sorts of very exciting science, and Dorothy went to see her friends, and Dorothy had very clear ideas about how she could do her science. I mean, she borrowed just about penicillin, vitamin B12 and insulin from the industry. They all came, so you know there was a reverse transfer into academia. So from that experience, I always felt that doing translational research could be really quite pleasurable. And as you may know, I formed 2 companies, and I think the closest thing I got to a commune is like, I shouldn't say my company, but the company I co-founded, Aztecs, where we all own shares. It's fantastic when you have some success. You don't ask who's going to be the first author and the last author of the Nature paper. You know, you're all pleased that something positive is happening. But it's also very good science. I had a terrific problem recruiting in my own group in Cambridge, because everybody actually wanted to go into Aztecs 10, 12 years ago. So I think we have to do a little bit more to understand how we can convince our colleagues that we can do fun and really original science and still translate it. And I think some of the things we have to get over are really quite old. For example, in 1995, in I think the Sussex Science Policy Unit, Faulkner and Senker produced this very interesting analysis of knowledge frontiers. And I think it's still not understood that certainly biomedical sciences, beyond everything else, is a continuously interactive process. You exchange knowledge all the time. It's not a linear model. You don't transfer the baton to a company. You have to keep interacting. And that's why, of course, we need to tell government that unless you have strong biomedical sciences, you won't have a biomedical industry. And it's true also for agriculture and environmental sciences. So let's remind people that we're in a continuous interaction with small companies and large companies. And moreover, the large companies, and it's not only the pharmaceutical industry, are changing their model. So the whole idea of open innovation, I'm always amazed that the Glaxo, as you know, closed down Harlow. At almost the same month they put 30 million into my company when I'd already stolen most of their people and they'd stolen some back. And of course what they were doing is trying to think of how you would use the sort of experience of small companies to structure. And so this really means that we have an opportunity in the biomedical sciences to interact very, very closely with industry. I personally think that if we don't get the big company, the small sort of biotech type company, the clinical trials and the basic science all interacting in a constant knowledge exchange environment, then we won't have any funding for basic science in the future. And we've seen huge losses from Pfizer, from AstraZeneca, and other companies. This is a real economic challenge, and I think it's up to all of us to really play a role. But in doing that, I think it's fun. I enjoy doing that. I think you're going to have to learn a little bit from some of the things I found in Cambridge when I arrived. I don't want to be too Cambridge-oriented, but the Cambridge phenomenon is pretty interesting. You know, the first company I formed was called Biofabrica in 1988. I had no idea of what the criteria were. But coming to Cambridge, I suddenly realized that you needed serial entrepreneurs. You need guys who've done things before. And what's also very important is you need lots of young people who are willing to move. So, you know, suddenly you find you have 2 people in the lab, and suddenly you get money, and you need to expand your company, and you need young people. And the implication of that is you need a community of young scientists who are going to move from one company to the other, rather than from one department to the other in a large company. And I think that model is also very important for us to understand. So I think we've got a lot to learn as biologists, but I think with HUBS and with the great support of Society of Biology, we're getting it right. And so I'd like to leave you just with one of my favorite literary quotations, and that's from Goethe. Goethe said that for many of us, science is the highest thing. It's a heavenly goddess. He said, but for others, it's a proficient cow who supplies us with butter. So I would like to think that HUBS would join me in honouring the goddess and milking the cow.